My first question is, why is effective political and civilian control of the military is essential to democracy?
Okay, well, thank you for your questions. I would like to stress that my work in Hungary was replicated in significant parts in the same task in the Slovak Republic, the Czech Republic, Romania, and the Republic of Georgia. So I've dealt with the issue of civilian and military control of the military in each of those countries. And there was great similarity of conditions in Hungary, the Slovak Republic, and the Czech Republic. Quite different in Romania, and very significantly different in the Republic of Georgia. So from that background, I would make 4 points, and then I will answer your question in some detail. One of the most important factors that one needs to understand in addressing the countries that came out from what I will call the control of the Warsaw Pact, or the influence of the Warsaw Pact after the Cold War, was to really understand the significance of the term democracy versus republic, because none of these countries were true democracies. They operated more as republics following democratic principles of free enterprise and the like. And the major issue was the experiential base of the population and how to address the people's experience under many years of an older regime in accepting the changes of new democratic principles, because they were foreign to them. And that was particularly true of both the military and the civilian leadership. The second major issue that we faced was the past, current, and future institutional cultures of the institutions. And you will probably deal with that in your study. But when you go into a population of leaders whose experience, whether they were young or whether they were old, were dominated with the culture and principles of a regime, a political and military regime that was very foreign to democratic Western ways. And so they needed to understand and gain some experience in how a military organization works subordinate to civilian control. And they had to understand how the West worked as a partner and member of NATO versus a partner and member of the Warsaw Pact. Marked differences and changes for which they had no experiential base. And that was a big transitional issue. And finally, we had to understand the intellectual grounding and experience of the 2 major institutions you're studying, political and military. The intellectual foundation. And I don't use the word ideology, but the intellectual foundation where they came from. And I use that as those 4 points as just as an overview. And I will cite one example before I answer your question. When I was in Hungary, one of the things that is markedly different between the Hungarian armed forces and the Western armed forces, meaning the US, Great Britain, Germany, etc., was the role of the non-commissioned officer. because when we arrived in Hungary and started visiting the units around the country, the military units, we found the role of the non-commissioned officer was very weak. They did not have the responsibility and authority that non-commissioned officers, the sergeants and the warrant officers, had in Germany or Great Britain or the United States. Because under the Soviet system, the officers did all the leading. The NCOs didn't. And so Hungary had established an NCO academy, which was a great step to move forward. And in the process of doing that, they had controls in the military NCO academy that were not in keeping with the objectives that they sought. And I went back through history, and Hungary in the 1930s, before World War II, had a very strong NCO corps and strong NCO education. But during the World War II, when Nazi influence was sort of supreme, and then the Cold War, when the Warsaw Pact influence dominated, the role of the NCO began to move towards the Soviet model, and then Hungary had to bring it back. And as we talked to the leadership of the NCO Academy, they resisted some of the change until we showed them, look, go back to your own history. You did it right in the 1930s, consistent with what NATO wanted. So just an example. Now to answer your question, what are the effective political and military controls in a democracy? The first thing I would point out is to have clear foundation documents and their origin, and to understand their origin. The one thing I always did when I went into a new country like Hungary, I studied the Constitution. I didn't just read it. I studied it as you study in your university. Mm-hmm. And I studied the governing laws that govern the military. Now, why did I do that? I did that so I would understand why the military does what it does and why the ministry does what it does. And that's very important when you do a study as you're doing. And then I looked at the issues of the past and the current, future institutional cultures of the nation's institution. And you can look at that by examining the institutions that control the elements of national power of a country. And that is the political, the military, the economic, and the religious institutional cultures, and how they work in your population, and how they work in the civilian leadership of the Ministry of Defense and the military leadership in the General Staff and all of the subordinate commands of Army, Navy, Air Force. And that was very important, that we get the grounding and the experience. Because to be successful in our support of the Hungarian Ministry of Defense and the Armed Forces was to help them make the needed change to get into, to conform to NATO principles and be accepted into NATO as a member of NATO. And the experiential base was very strong, but not on the principles of Western military operation and civilian control of the militaries. It was still influenced very heavily by their many years of experience under the Warsaw Pact, and before that, even under the influence, before the end of World War II, of Nazi Germany. And so once you understood that, you then could go in and help the leadership understand not only the changes that needed to be made to conform to Western principles, but how to go about it. And so that was an important understanding. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. What are the essential elements of civilian control?
The essential elements of civilian control of the military begins with, as I said earlier, the foundation documents and their origin. The Constitution of a country, and that was true of all the countries I worked in on similar efforts, the Constitution should in all cases provide the framework under which the Ministry of Defense functions. And the origin of that is very important. When I first went into these countries, the Constitution of Hungary and Slovakia and the other countries were very prescriptive. I know in Slovakia, I worked with a couple of lawyers that had helped write the Constitution personally. And just like in Hungary, the Constitution was written with the mindset of ensuring the authority and operations of the military within their country was controlled and limited, because prior to that, under the Warsaw Pact and Soviet influence, the military had dominant authority. And the writers of the Constitution of both countries and the other countries I worked in went out of the way to prescribe and limit the authority and responsibility of the military. And so what we found was, in the document and in the origin, the political leadership at the national level went out of their way and made it very clear that the military control and influence on the governance of their country would be restricted. And therefore they wrote into the Constitution many very specific tasks, rather than to describe the objectives and principles that defense should operate within, leaving to the Minister of Defense the how-to regulations and guidance to the military command structure. And so that was a very important thing that a country must establish within its controlling documents. And now when you go down in Hungary at that time to the next level of laws that governed, that transition from the Constitution to policy making within defense. And these laws were so prescriptive that when you went into a logistics office at a military base, or in the ministry, or in the joint staff, you would ask, may I read your regulation on logistics. They didn't have a regulation. They had a law that prescribed everything you had to do. And so, to get back to civilian military control, what are the prerequisites? It's for each level to understand responsibilities, authorities, and accountabilities. And if you prescribe that at the right level, and then distinguish the responsibilities at a broad level in the Constitution, then in law, then in regulations, then in policy statements, so that the right responsibility is prescribed at each level. But in broad terms, and then when you get down to military regulations, they're more prescriptive. And those are essential to having an effective military and civilian control.
What do you think of the process of the establishment of political and civilian control of the Hungarian military after the regime change?
Well, I arrived in Hungary in 1998, almost a decade after the Berlin Wall fell. And the civilian control was fractured. And it was fractured for many reasons, but the two most pronounced that needs to be present are experienced people. And Hungary didn't have experienced people in the military or the civilian sector. They had experienced people in the old system, but not in the new system. And the ministry didn't have a sufficient number of experienced civilian leaders because the military was dominant in the older regime. When I went into Hungary, the Ministry of Defense and Joint Staff had 107 civilian employees, and most of those were clerical. Most of them were secretaries, much like Petra. And so they didn't have civilians with enough experience in Western principles and doctrine to serve, in my judgment, effectively doing what they should do at their level of responsibility in translating for the government, from the government laws, down to the command structure of the line Army, Navy, Air Force. Nor did you have experience among the senior officers in those military organizations, because the generals had grown up from lieutenant to general in the Soviet system, and the colonels and the lieutenant colonels and the majors and all of that. The soldiers, they were good soldiers because you do kind of the same thing as a soldier in most of these organizations, except at the non-commissioned officer and officer leader level. So that's what we found. And again, the regulations were very prescriptive, and I have explained that. Now, let me digress for a moment, because it addresses what we found when we got there and the time it took to change it. And I would compliment all of the civilian leaders and military leaders. They were very anxious to change They knew they needed to change, but it took time. And to give you an example, and these were significant reactions. The armed forces were told they didn't have enough NCOs and warrant officers to meet NATO standards, because in the Western Army, the non-commissioned officers carry an enormous amount of leadership responsibility at company and below. But they didn't have enough. And so in one day, there were 1,500 NCOs and warrant officers created. Bang, just like that. And so you came into the Ministry of Defense headquarters, and all of the secretaries, Petra, dressed like you, were dressed in a Hungarian uniform of a NCO. And they were wearing red pumps or blue pumps because they didn't have the military high-heeled shoes, because they didn't have the female NCOs. But they got their 1,500 NCOs in the stroke of a pen. Now those 15 had absolutely zero experience to be an NCO leader of a military unit such as a squad or a formation of any type. But that was the good faith effort to make change rapidly. Now on the plus side, they put those 1,500 through training and education to grow their capability, but the experience was missing. So, let's see. Okay, I want to make the point on the military leaders and the civilian leaders. The military leaders across the board were extraordinarily good commanders and leaders of their units. Whether it was the Chief of Staff, General Vague, could have been Chief of Staff to any army in the West. He was superb. And, but as a group, not him, but as a group, they were reluctant to give up the authority and responsibility that they had had before. Because as an officer in the armed forces, it was a very strategic and recognizable position in the society, Hungarian society. They were very proud to be colonels and generals and majors because of the importance that the Hungarian people attached to them from the old regime. And they were afraid, in my judgment, that they would lose it. And so they were more reluctant to say, yes, I respond to civilian leadership. I don't respond just to the military. Now, the civilian leaders, on the other hand, didn't know the difference, or didn't accept the difference between the responsibilities of civilian control versus the responsibility of military command. You command units. And the chain of command of the military, from the CHOD all the way down to the lowest squad or pilot in a squadron, is through the military chain of command. But you would have in the Ministry of Defense a Deputy State Secretary or a subordinate leader within the Ministry of Defense pick up the phone and call a brigade commander in Debrecen and issue orders to do something. And the chain of command would know nothing about it. that brigade's command structure, all the way up to the Chad, would have no idea that a deputy state secretary had called a brigade and issued orders. And that's not civilian control. And civilian control doesn't mean the civilian leaders command military units. The Minister of Defense and his state secretaries provide overall guidance to the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces. And then they translate that down through military orders and regulations to the heads of the Army, Navy, Air Force. And then they issue the instructions to the brigade and division commanders and the like. That did not exist when we first got there. The willingness to change did exist because the leaders were fundamentally very solid people. They just didn't have the experience that was needed.
Okay. And what was your experience when you first confronted this issue, and in what capacity?
When I went into Hungary in 1998, I was the team leader of a group of 10 to 12 people that were drawn from the retired community of the United States Army and Marine Corps, United States Marine Corps. And they were all leader focused. By that I mean they had held important leadership positions in the United States military of their respective service. And that's what we did. Now, my experience I've captured in part in your earlier questions. The first and foremost thing that we had to do was to understand where the Hungarian army was coming from. There was a lot of internal resistance to change that was, as I said before, influenced by the reluctance to give up authority and responsibility. But there were also personal influences. We found that, in contrast to the armed forces of the United States that I grew up with, my loyalty, starting as a lieutenant to senior general, my loyalty was to the country and the armed forces. I didn't know whether I was a Republican or a Democrat. And if I did know, I ignored it, because my loyalty and all of my actions and all of my decisions were predicated on a principle of supporting the government of the United States and the citizens of the United States, and to support the military chain of command. And what we found was, in too many examples, when you got to the senior level, now down at the junior level of lieutenants and below, they were just good soldiers. But the higher up you went in the ranks, they would identify more with political parties than I was accustomed to seeing. And they would identify in political parties more with individual leaders. True of the Air Force, had trained extensively in the Soviet Union. And in the Hungarian Air Force, a large percentage of their senior officers were married to Russian wives, because they would go there as young officers for extended training, and the human nature would take over, and they would come back with a a Russian wife. In fact, the head of the Hungarian Air Force wife was from Russia. And they were I'm not saying anything wrong, but it was an influence. The cultural influence on the Hungarian leadership was different than the cultural influence on the leaders of Western armed forces. And in that regard, one senior military commander hosted a reception for a political campaign of one party and one individual, which would never would occur in a Western Army or Air Force Navy, because that's the difference between civilian control and military command. And your loyalty in a military is to country and to your chain of command. And a point that I should have made earlier, another illustrative example of military control. In Hungary, again, during my early time in Hungary and in talking to the Chad, he voiced an issue to me about promotion of general officers. And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "I will have meetings at this desk, and a new Hungarian general will come in and sit down. And I didn't know he had ever been promoted from colonel to general, but one of the state secretaries had promoted him." And you see, that's a no-no in civilian control. The civilians don't promote. Now, the Minister of Defense can approve the promotions and should approve the promotions of the general officers. And that's done routinely in Western military forces. And so after all of this was explained, then those practices changed. And so I'm sure it's all right now. And another example of a very senior general officer in Hungary, he and the state secretary and I were in a room, and I was talking about the difference in responsibilities of a state secretary and the senior military, just like I'm explaining to you all now about who makes the decision in civilian control of the military. And I explained that the responsibility and authority for the level of decisions we were talking about belonged to the civilian authority. And the civilian authority, the civilian state secretary, and the senior military officer got into an argument right in front of me, surprisingly in English. And the general was saying, "But you don't know anything about the military. You can't make a decision about the military because you don't know anything about it. I'm the one that has the experience, and I'm the one that should make the decision." And I say, time out. You command. The civilian authority controls the high-level policy, and that's what we're talking about. But that's another example of the military's reluctance to give more responsibility and authority to civilian leaders. But in what you're doing in your study, I would argue that it's very critical that be really defined on the role of ministry and the limits on their authority, and the role of the military and the limits on their authority. Now, there's another important point. You see, I've made a lot of notes. It's important that you not only in your study, and I don't know where it goes, but we never made a recommendation without telling the Hungarian leadership what needed to be done to fix it. And those were always in our recommendations. And there was one rule that I had for our team, was that we would only recommend. We could never direct. It was not our army. It was the Hungarians' army. And we were not the leaders of their army. They were the leaders of their armed forces. And they would make decisions. And our mission was to lay everything out clearly in the most persuasive way we could, recognizing not just United States doctrine, but British doctrine and German doctrine particularly, and interestingly, Hungarian doctrine, because many of the leaders were educated or familiar with those countries. So we didn't try to impose an American solution on the Hungarian armed forces.
What exactly was your job in supporting this process, aside from what you have already said?
My job was providing advice and recommendation to both civilian and military, and to make sure it was balanced and well thought out and consistent with our understanding of the Hungarian Constitution and laws at that time, so that we would not give them a recommendation that was a violation of law or Constitution. And I had a responsibility, I felt, on advising on military education and training, and advising on the curriculum of the military academy, and to introduce the concept of senior staff colleges for the mid-level, meaning major lieutenant colonel, and then senior level, meaning full colonel, and training and educational methodology for the generals on how they might begin to better understand that it's all right to give up responsibility and authority to civilian control, because that's where it belongs in a democracy. See, it didn't belong that way in the regime they were trained in. So you had to change that mindset. So I would say that was my major task.
And what were the most difficult problems you had to confront during this time?
We've talked about a lot of that, but I will give you these papers in addition to your recording what I'm saying. The biggest problem we faced was on the military side more than the civilian side, and that was the reluctance of military leaders to give up control. And concurrent with that was the failure of the senior leaders within the Ministry of Defense to understand the difference between control and command, and I've talked to that. And then the failure at every level to delegate responsibilities and authorities, and this was particularly true in military organizations. And let me talk about that for a moment, because hopefully it has changed. the military guidance that would come out of the Ministry of Defense to an artillery battalion in Pesh would tell them where to go in the field for their training, where to lay their artillery batteries to set up their guns, and how to register their artillery battery. It would go into minute detail from the CHOD's level all the way down to placing an artillery tube at a specific location on a specific range, rather than giving the mission to the commander of artillery. And then the commander of artillery would give the mission to the battalion commander, who would give it to the battery commander. Then the battery commander would give the order on how to place the artillery position. And that was a huge problem. And the first armored battalion we went into in Hungary, that battalion had one training manual, and it was in the battalion commander's safe. So the company commanders of that armor battalion would get all of its instructions and doctrinal guidance from the battalion, as opposed to from the company commander. And so it's the willingness to delegate, because when you delegate, you develop leaders. And particularly in the NCO Corps, each tank commander is an NCO or warrant officer, but they got all of their specific instructions from their platoon leader, not leaving to the platoon leader general instructions on how to train the NCOs. One of the weaknesses of the Soviet Army is that specific failure, because their individual tank commanders don't have the freedom of action to make their own tactical decisions based on the fight that they see in front of them. So that would be my answer to you. The lack of leader development and the experience and training to delegate authority. And with delegating authority implies delegating a responsibility concurrent with it.
And how did you try to help them to manage these problems?
We tried to, number one, influence the curriculum of the NCO academies and the officer educational system, their military academy and their educational system of officers going up in the chain of command. That was the principal reason. And then we tried to show them practices that existed in the military units and the staffs and the leaderships of the Hungarian armed forces that were not consistent with responsibilities and authorities of civilian control of the military and civilian command of military units. Those were the principal methods. And we did briefings, we did reports, and we did a lot of what I would call, in the terminology I was raised with, was after-action reviews, in which a unit will do something. Maybe it's tank gunnery, maybe it's practicing artillery, in which you get everybody around the table or in the field, just in a circle, in which the commander will get up and say, okay, what did we do right and what did we do wrong? and every member of that organization is invited to speak freely. This is what we did wrong because Lieutenant Beckish screwed it up. Well, what did he screw up? He did these 3 things wrong. And if we had been in a live fight, we would have gotten killed. And so the group discusses what should have been done, and then the lieutenant learns from it. And everybody learns from it. And that's called an after-action review. And we would do those types of things almost at every level. Here's what we think you didn't do right. Or here's what we think you did great. Now let's go back and figure out how to do the wrong things great. And that's a leader development concept. Leader development. You develop the young NCOs and the young officers as they grow up. They learn your doctrine, and they learn how to be leaders. They learn how to take responsibility and the authority that they are given. And they know if they don't do it right, they'll be held accountable for not doing it right. But they've got to know what right is.
All right, my last question is, what do you know of the current situation in Hungary regarding the military civilian control?
I don't know a lot. I know their armed forces has been reduced to about 1/3 of what it used to be. One thing we did for General Vague was we designed the table of organization and equipment for the 1st NATO Brigade. We sat down with a few of the Hungarian officers, mainly at the major and lieutenant colonel level, and we took the organizational structure of an armor battalion, an infantry battalion, and the like that would be a part of this brigade. And then we designed the new brigade structure consistent with the NATO doctrine. Not US doctrine, but NATO doctrine. It would fit Germany or England or anybody. And we designed its people and its equipment and all of that. And General Vague directed the reorganization of the brigade in that regard. And I know that those organizational changes were promulgated throughout Hungary while we were there. I don't know whether they've been changed or not, but hopefully what we did put them in the right structures to function in NATO as NATO would ask them to do. I also know that the Hungarian military have served with distinction in Iraq. In one of my working efforts with defense, I spent multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan with the purpose of integrating State Department and Department of Defense operations. And I know the Hungarian effort was rated very high, so it's clear that their effectiveness continued to improve, not because of us or me, but because of the leadership of the Hungarian Armed Forces. So I don't know as much as I should, but I don't have the contacts I used to have, and it's been a long time.